Welcome to the next video in exposure. Let's do it. Hey everyone, my name is Andy Baeza and I'm a photographer, videographer, and audio engineer here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And if you're new to the channel, thanks so much for taking the time out to watch. It means so much to me. And if you're not new, thanks so much for coming back because I really love having you here. And if you haven't already, go ahead and give it a thumbs up, hit that subscribe button, and hit the notification bell because
it'd be a lot cooler if you did.
So in part one of this series, we talked about the exposure triangle. And today we're gonna talk about exposure in video and how it's more like a trapezoid. So with video, the same parts of the exposure triangle are there. ISO or gain, aperture, and shutter speed. But in video, we add a fourth element called ND or neutral density. And we'll get to ND in just a bit and how it's beneficial, but first let's take a look at how each of the other elements affect the look of your video. So I'll start with my favorite, aperture. Aperture controls the depth of field the same way that it does in photography. A shallower depth of field can be incredibly useful when trying to bring attention to a subject, just as in photography. However, when manually focusing in video, as is the preference for a lot of videographers or those using cinema lenses or lenses without autofocus capabilities, it can be incredibly difficult to maintain focus on a subject that's moving back and forth in and out of the focal plane. Now, a shallower depth of field can be very visually effective when you have a subject that's walking into frame or when you're trying to shift focus between two different subjects, known as a rack focus. However, if a talking subject, for instance, has a lot of back and forth movement, it can be very distracting to watch them go in and out of focus. Stopping down the aperture can give you a little bit more wiggle room when you don't have somebody there who's specifically dedicated to be pulling focus. Now, another thing to consider with aperture in video is the difference between f-stops and t-stops. We'll get to that in another video, but to simplify, f-stops are a measurement of the diameter of the aperture relative to the focal length of the lens. T-stops are a measurement of the amount of light physically getting to the sensor. Because of different coatings on lenses and the way that different lenses react, there can be a variable in the amount of light physically transmitted from one f2.8 lens to another. But a T1.5 lens and another T1.5 lens will have the same amount of light hitting the sensor on each camera. This is incredibly important when talking about film and lighting and multi-camera exposure values, and we'll get to that in another video. Next up, we'll talk about ISO or gain. Photography has a little bit more wiggle room as to what's considered acceptable for ISO than in video. For instance, a higher ISO image can still be pleasing to the eye in a photograph, whereas in video, it can be too noisy to be visually appealing at all. That's not to say that all noise is bad or even unexpected in certain situations, but keeping noise to a minimum is far more of a concern in video, as removing it in post can be far more difficult than with a still image. Film grain is an often sought after quality in both stills and video, and a lot of times is added to get a certain look or feel to an image. However, film grain looks completely different than digital noise, which often adds color artifacts that can distort the way the image is intended to look. Every camera sensor is different in its ISO performance and the way it handles noise, and every camera has a limit to its acceptable noise level. It's up to you to determine what that is for your camera, as it can be a bit subjective. Next up is shutter speed or shutter angle. This one's kind of the oddball of the group, as it really shouldn't be changing once you have it set. So, I want you to do me a favor. Yeah, you. Okay, I'm obviously just assuming that you're doing this, but do me a favor. I want you to take your hand and just wave it in front of your face. Just like this, okay? Moderate speed, can be really fast if you want it to, that'll exaggerate this. But what you'll notice is a certain amount of motion blur as it's moving in front of your face. It's how our eyes and our brain communicate motion and what we're seeing, and it's a natural part of everyday life for us. Setting your shutter speed or shutter angle properly gives you a natural sense of motion blur in video, which makes it a little bit more pleasing and natural to look at. The rule of thumb for this...
Wait, rule of thumb?
As a general rule, you want to set your shutter speed to double whatever your frame rate is. Now, if you're filming at 24 frames a second, as I am here, you'd want to set your shutter speed to 1/48 of a second. DSLR and mirrorless, they don't have 1/48 of a second. We're running off of photography shutter speeds. So you would have 1/50th because that's as close as you can actually get. This will give you a natural amount of motion blur in each frame. Now, raising your shutter speed will do exactly the same thing as it does in photography. It will freeze the action more in each frame. So if we set it to 1/500th of a second, as I'm doing here, you'll see that my hand is no longer blurred as it moves in front of my face. It looks really unnatural. Now this can be off-putting to watch, which might explain why the effect is used so often in certain horror movie styles. It adds a certain amount of jitter to the look, especially when something is moving, but I don't want all of my videos to look like a horror movie. Or do I? Now, shutter angle is a term that's originally used in film cinema cameras that had a rotary shutter. As film would move through the camera, the shutter would spin and let light onto each frame once per revolution. A shutter angle could go up to a maximum of 360 degrees, meaning that it's just always open and the film is just flying through. But when using a 360 degree shutter angle, just like having a slower shutter speed, you get more motion blur. Setting your shutter speed to double your frame rate is essentially giving you a 180 degree shutter. If you slow that down to 1/24th or 25th of a second, depending on your camera, that essentially opens it up and gives you a 360 degree shutter because your shutter speed is moving at the same rate as your frame. Now, something that's impossible to do with a rotary shutter on a film camera, but is actually very easy to do in digital, often by mistake, is having a more than 360 degree shutter. Essentially, dropping your shutter speed below that of your frame rate. So if my frame rate is 24 frames a second or 1/24th of a second, but I shoot at 1/13th or 1/11th of a second, your video will look like it's buffering over a bad internet connection. Now this might work if you were trying to pull off that exact effect in camera. But since 99.99999% or more of your video is not going to be shot going for that same effect, stick with double your frame rate. Your viewers and your clients will thank you. Shutter speed can be subjective, as you might be looking for that crisp, high detailed, super fast moving sports or action or whatever. Most of the time, I recommend sticking with double your frame rate because it just looks natural and more pleasing to our eye. So what happens when you're filming in bright daylight and you're trying to get a shallow depth of field and your ISO is as low as it'll go and your shutter speed, well, if you're not raising it over double your frame rate, you're fairly limited. That's where our fourth element comes in, ND or neutral density. Neutral density is kind of like sunglasses for your camera. You're putting a piece of glass that should avoid any color shifts, which is why it's called neutral, in front of your lens to cut down on the stops of light that are hitting your sensor. Now we use ND filters all the time in still photography, especially when shooting landscapes and the like. But because you have a little bit more leeway to really crank that shutter, you'll find yourself using an ND filter more in video when trying to maintain that exposure balance in bright sunlight. ND filters come in a variety of styles and quality, and some might shift color one way or another, and they'll come in either fixed stops or variable. For instance, this is a 1.5 stop to 8 stop ND filter, and this is a 5 to 10 stop ND filter, meaning they cut down 5 to 10 stops of light. For example, this one would allow you to go from 1/1600th of a second to 1/50th of a second with 5 stops of light reduction. And this makes a huge difference in the final look of your film. Now, I tend to prefer variable ND filters in a run-and-gun situation when things can change very quickly, because it allows me to finely tune my exposure to get the exact depth of field that I want. But be careful, certain lower quality filters or filters that don't have hard stops on them, oftentimes you'll end up getting the dreaded X pattern that you see here. So if you're new to video or maybe have been confused about how these things differ from still photography, I hope this helps clear the air a little bit. Again, hit that like button, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and share the video. You know, I'm really trying to make this a lot more consistent in 2020 and do these things weekly, and it really helps keep me motivated. So that's gonna be it for me. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.